Dust rose from the boards of Main Street, thick and slow, like smoke from a fire with nowhere to go. It clung to the air, refusing to settle. A man stood at the edge of that street, his boots worn clean through at the heel, his shirt hung loose on his frame, as if the fabric itself had given up on him. In his arms, he held a bundle wrapped in frayed linen. A newborn baby, no more than a fortnight old, her tiny fists clenching at the harsh noon sun. He held her like she was the last good thing in the world, because for him, she was. His eyes, sunken and dark from grief and too many nights without sleep, scanned the faces in the town. But nobody cared to meet his gaze. They just looked away, shuffled their feet, pretended he wasn't there. Then, across the street, a whip cracked. The sound shot through the town like a bolt of lightning, but no thunder followed. Only a pitiful sight. A young woman, maybe 22, flinching as the leather bit into her back. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, the rope cutting through cotton and skin. The hand holding that whip belonged to her father. A man made of rock and bitter water. His jaw was clenched tight around the words he spat, louder than the strikes themselves. "You'll learn, girl. You'll learn your place." Folks on their porches paused. Hands hovered over belts, fingers tightened on skirts. But nobody moved. In a town like this, cruelty was as common as dust, and mercy was as rare as a summer rain. The preacher on the corner lowered his Bible. He just closed his eyes. But the rancher, the man with the baby, he stepped forward. His jaw was tight. His daughter let out a soft whimper in his arms, and that little sound was more powerful than the crack of any whip. He cleared his throat. His voice was rough, like it hadn't been used in days. "Sell her to me," he said. His words sliced through the air, cleaner than the whip. Heads turned. The street fell silent. "I want a mother for my girl." The father froze mid-swing, the rope dangling from his fist. He turned his head slow, spit a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the ground, and squinted at the rancher. He looked at him like he was trying to measure a man's madness just by sight. "What in God's green earth did you just say?" The rancher took another step forward, dust puffing up around his worn boots. He adjusted the baby in his arms, her little face pressed against his chest, her cries muffled by the cloth. "Sell her," he said again. His voice was quieter this time, but steadier. "And I'll take her far away from your hand. I need someone. She needs someone." A nasty ripple of laughter went through the crowd. It was nervous and sharp. Women shook their heads, whispering about the scandal. Men just smirked and nudged each other. The father's eyes had a cruel gleam. "She ain't worth a lame mule, let alone your horse. She's barren, useless, ain't fit for nothing but hard work and harder lessons." The young woman lifted her face. Strands of hair were stuck to her damp cheeks. A little trail of blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. But her eyes, dark and steady, locked onto the rancher. It was the first time all day anyone had looked at him without scorn. She searched his hollowed-out expression, and she saw something in there. It wasn't gallantry, it wasn't desire. It was the trembling, honest truth of a man who had run clean out of choices. "You don't know me," she whispered. Her voice was raw, like each word was a splinter being forced past her bruised lips. "I ain't no mother." He shifted the child in his arms, rocking her just a little. His own body was shaking, like every breath was costing him something dear. "Neither am I a father," he answered, his voice cracking right down the middle with the weight of his own truth. "But I mean to learn." The preacher's voice rose up, steady as a hymn from the back of a church. "The good book says, 'Fathers, provoke not your children to wrath.' Seems some folks done tore that page right out." The father just scowled. He snapped the rope hard against the heel of his boot. His eyes darted between the rancher's gaunt face and the little baby squirming in his arms. "What you got to give, fool?" he spat. "You got dust for land, cows that ain't given milk in a month, and a grief still hanging on your shoulders so heavy it's a wonder you can stand. You think you can carry another burden?" "I got nothing," the rancher said. It was plain and simple. "Except her, and I'll trade what's left of me if it means she don't grow up alone." The silence that followed was heavy. It pressed down on the whole street. The wind kicked up little scraps of paper, a wagon wheel creaked somewhere in the distance, but nobody spoke. The young woman stood there, the rope still trailing from her torn dress. The faint red lines on her arms were burning like fresh brands. She looked from her father's cruel hand to the tiny infant in the rancher's arms. For a second, she swayed on her feet, like she was caught between the lash she knew and a future she couldn't even imagine. Her father let out a low, mean chuckle. Madness, pure damn madness. He shook his head, but a little glimmer of calculation flickered in his eyes. He saw a deal to be made. Maybe a horse, then. The last horse you got. Trade it, and you can take her. See if you still call yourself wise when the first snow falls. The rancher's jaw worked back and forth. His grip tightened on the child. He could feel every single eye in that crowd on him, mocking him, condemning him, pitying him. His boots felt like they were nailed to the ground, but his heart was surging forward with a desperate, crazy clarity. The young woman lifted her chin. Her shoulders squared, despite the rope burns. Her breath was trembling, but her gaze was steady. In that one look, she seemed to be asking him without words, "Do you mean this? Do you really see me?" The rancher shifted the baby in his arms. Her tiny hand curled around the edge of his collar. He swallowed hard, and his voice came out low but clear. "Name your price." And just like that, the hush on the street got deeper. It was like heaven itself had leaned down to listen in. The crowd had shuffled in tighter, boots scraping in the dust, their eyes hungry for a spectacle. A horse trade for a woman wasn't anything new out west. But there was something strange about this bargain. The raw desperation of the man clutching his infant daughter held them captive, like a sermon nobody dared to interrupt. The father, with the rope coiled in his fist, smirked like he was holding all the cards in a high-stakes game. His daughter stood there, her back welted, her dress torn, her chin trembling but somehow unbowed. The rancher took a slow breath. It felt like every word he had left was pressed into his chest, like a prayer he hadn't said yet. "My horse is all I got," he said. His voice didn't carry with strength. It had the brittle clarity of a man who had nothing left to protect but the tiny bundle in his arms. "But she's worth it. She's worth it if it means my girl grows up knowing a hand that doesn't strike." Laughter cracked out, sharp as dry kindling. One man spat tobacco juice into the dirt and muttered, "A fool's bargain. He'll starve by winter." Another one just shook his head, pity disguised as scorn. The preacher raised a hand, murmuring, "The Lord sets the lonely in families." But nobody was listening. The father tilted his head, his eyes narrowing, savoring the moment. "A horse, then," he said slowly, as if he was tasting the words. "You trade flesh for flesh, a fine beast for a useless girl. Done." He struck his rope hard against the ground. The crack sealed the bargain, not with ink, but with pure cruelty. The rancher shifted the newborn against his shoulder. His heart was pounding like he'd just signed away his soul. The baby stirred, her tiny fists pressing against his chest. Her cry was weak but insistent. It was a little reminder of the promise he'd made to her mother on her dying breath. Don't let her grow up alone. The young woman's breath caught in her throat. Her own father had just traded her life for a horse without a moment's hesitation, without even the courtesy of a decent insult. She stared at the rancher, not with gratitude, but with the raw, ragged shock of someone who'd been unnamed, sold by blood and bought by a stranger. Her voice scraped from her throat, low and rough. "You don't know what you're asking. You don't know me." The rancher's eyes met hers. They were steady, even though they were shadowed by exhaustion. "I don't need to know," he said. "You ain't being asked to be a wife, or a servant, just a mother for this child." He paused, his voice breaking like a dry twig. "That's all. Neither of us needs saving, we just need a place to start." Something shifted in the air then. It was as faint as a breeze moving through a shuttered room. She didn't step forward, but her eyes softened just for a flicker. It was like she was testing the shape of hope against years and years of cruelty. Her father snorted, disgust curling his lip. "Go on then, girl. Better you waste yourself on him than eat my bread for another day." He gave her a rough shove toward the rancher, as if she were a calf being sold at market. She stumbled, but she caught herself. She squared her shoulders. The rope marks still burned bright red against her skin, but she lifted her chin with a stubborn dignity her father had never managed to beat out of her. She walked the space between them slowly, each step echoed in the hush of the street. She walked until she stood right in front of the rancher and the child. The baby whimpered, and without even thinking, the young woman reached out a hand. Her fingers brushed against the linen bundle. Then they curled away, quick, as if she'd been burned. Her breath hitched, her eyes darted to the rancher. He didn't press her. He didn't beg her to take the child. He just waited. The silence around them was filled with the weight of a choice. For the first time in her life, nobody was shouting at her. Nobody was commanding her to obey. The decision was hers and hers alone. And that truth frightened her more than the rope ever had. Her voice, when it finally came, was as raw as an open wound. "I ain't no mother. I ain't soft. I ain't fit." The rancher's jaw clenched. He shifted the baby higher against his chest, his own hand shaking as he rocked her gently. "Neither am I a father," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the child's face, "but I mean to learn. And I reckon that's enough." The preacher whispered an amen under his breath, his voice trembling like a reed in the wind. The young woman closed her eyes. She could hear it all again, the crack of the whip, the laughter of the crowd, the silence of every neighbor who had just turned away. Then she opened them. She looked at the infant's soft face, red with need, helpless as she herself had once been. And in that fragile gaze, something that had been long buried inside her stirred. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was the ache of recognition. Behind her, her father spit again and strode off, the rope swinging against his thigh, certain he had rid himself of a burden. The crowd started to scatter, muttering, shaking their heads, whispering their judgments. But the rancher and the young woman didn't move. They just stood there, facing each other in the fading dust. Two strangers, bound not by desire or by a promise, but by the trembling breath of a child held between them. Finally, the rancher stepped aside. He gestured to the old wagon waiting at the edge of the street. His voice was almost a whisper. "If you'll come. If not, I'll find another way." The young woman's hand hovered one more time over the baby's blanket. Her breath trembled, and with it, the fragile silence of the street trembled too. The decision hadn't been made yet, but the world itself seemed to be leaning forward, waiting. Just as she was about to take a step, a new voice cut through the air. It was the town sheriff, a man named Barlow with a gut that spilled over his gun belt. "Hold on there, Caleb," he said, his voice lazy but hard. "This ain't a regular trade. Silas here." He gestured to the father, who had stopped in his tracks, a smug look on his face. "He wants to make sure his property is looked after." The woman froze. Property. Caleb's face hardened. The deal was the horse. "The horse gets you her labor," the sheriff said, grinning. "But Silas wants a guarantee. Says you're a man of grief, might not make it through the winter. He wants the deed to your land put up as collateral." A gasp went through the remaining crowd. The deed to his land. That was everything. Caleb stared at the sheriff, then at the father, Silas. He saw the trap. Everyone knew his ranch was failing. The land was all he had left from his wife, from his family. Silas wasn't selling his daughter. He was trying to steal a man's future. The woman looked at Caleb. She saw the impossible choice in his eyes. He could back out now. No one would blame him. He could give her back to the whip and keep the one thing he had left. She braced herself for the inevitable, for him to shake his head and walk away. But he didn't. He looked from her face to the baby in his arms, and then back to the sheriff. The exhaustion in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, something stubborn and wild. "Fine," Caleb said, his voice quiet but ringing with finality. "Draw up the papers. The deed for her freedom. But it's not collateral. It's a clean trade. If I fail, the land is his. But she belongs to no one." The sheriff's grin faded. Silas's jaw dropped. They had expected him to fold. They hadn't expected him to call their bluff and raise the stakes to a level of pure madness. He was betting his entire world on a woman he didn't know, and a promise he might not be able to keep. The woman felt the ground shift beneath her feet. This wasn't a purchase, it was a sacrifice. and it was being made for her. She took a slow, deliberate step toward the wagon. The road out of town stretched long and empty, bordered by sagebrush and a dry, whispering wind. The wheels of the old wagon groaned against the ruts in the road. The whole thing leaned under the weight of its sorrow as much as its small load. Caleb walked with his shoulders bent, cradling the baby close against his chest. Every step felt like a vow he didn't know how to keep. The woman, he had learned her name was Elara, sat in the back of the wagon. Her dress was torn at the hem, the rope marks still raw on her arms. Neither of them spoke. The only sound was the baby's fitful whimper and the slow creak of the wagon as it carried their silence westward. By dusk, the prairie turned to copper. The sky was bruised with purples and deep orange. Caleb stopped the wagon at a narrow, muddy creek. He set the bundle down gently in the wagon's shade. His hands shook as he tried to gather kindling, dropping the dry twigs more often than he picked them up. Ilara watched him, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable in the fading light. When his fire finally caught, it was weak and flickering. He produced a dirty pan and a handful of beans. The smell rose up, bitter and burned before it ever had a chance to soften. He forced himself to swallow a spoonful, gagging quietly, then he offered the pan to her. She just shook her head. The baby stirred again, crying with a thin, reedy sound. Ilara stiffened, then with a sigh that was half surrender and half instinct, she stepped forward. She lifted the child out of the wagon and into her arms with a surprising certainty. She rocked the baby gently until the cries settled down into little hiccups. Caleb stared, his lips parted, as if he was witnessing a miracle he didn't deserve. She avoided his eyes. She started humming under her breath. It might have been an old hymn, or maybe just a tune she remembered from girlhood. The baby's tiny hand curled around her sleeve, holding on with a strength that neither of them expected. When night fell, Ilara sat apart from the fire, the baby still sleeping in her arms. Caleb slumped near the flames, exhaustion finally pulling him under. Coyotes yipped in the distance. The stars started coming alive in the vast, dark sky above them. She gazed down at the child's small face, at the unformed innocence that knew nothing of ropes or bargains. She whispered words too soft for Caleb to hear. "You're the first soul that's ever held on to me without a demand." The next day's sun rose sharp, bleaching the color from the land. They moved slow. The wagon faltered against every rock in the road. This time, Ilara walked ahead of the wagon, her pace steady, her back straighter than it had been the night before. She hadn't agreed to anything. Not really, but with each mile she found herself adjusting the infant's blanket, steadying the makeshift cradle in the wagon when it jolted over a rut. Caleb noticed, but he didn't say anything. He just met her eyes once, when she handed the child back to him, his gratitude too heavy for words. Around noon, a wheel cracked on a dry rut. It split with a sound like a bone snapping. Caleb cursed under his breath, kneeling down to inspect the damage. His hands fumbled clumsily with the tools from his satchel, sweat dripping into his eyes. Ilara stood in the shade of the wagon, holding the baby. Finally she asked, "Do you even know what you're doing?" He glanced up, looking sheepish, a streak of dirt across his face. "Not rightly," he admitted, "but it's got to hold till we get home." She exhaled sharply through her nose, shifting the baby to one arm. Then she crouched down beside him. Her fingers, calloused from years of hard labor, steadied the wheel. She showed him how to bind it tight with a strip of cloth and some spare rope. Together they managed to fix it. It was clumsy, but it was enough to keep the wagon rolling. When the wheel held, he gave a short laugh. It was dry and weary, but it was real. She almost smiled, but she turned her face away before he could see it. That night they camped in a hollow, sheltered by a stand of cottonwoods. The fire burned stronger this time. Her hands had guided his when he fumbled with the flint and steel. She sat close enough to feel the warmth, but still far enough to guard her distance. The baby lay swaddled between them, the faint rise and fall of her chest a quiet tether binding the two strangers together. As the flames crackled, Ilara finally broke the silence. "Why'd you do it?" Her voice was low, brittle as glass. "Why take me? Was it pity, or just plain madness?" Caleb's eyes stayed fixed on the fire. He rubbed the back of his neck, the words slow in coming. My wife, Sarah, she died 2 weeks past, bringing this little one into the world. His voice was thick with a grief that was still raw. Her last words to me. She made me promise, don't let her grow up alone. I got no sisters, no kin, no neighbor who'd take her in. When I saw you there, standing in that street, I thought maybe two broken pieces could make one whole. She stared at the flames, her throat tight. You think I'm whole enough for that? He shook his head slowly. I don't reckon either of us is whole. But maybe that's the start. The fire snapped, sending a shower of sparks up into the dark. She pressed her lips together, looking down at the baby's tiny face, then at her own scarred hands. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of a choice pressing into her palms. Not chains, not orders, but a choice, and it scared her more than the rope ever had. As they sat there, a sound drifted on the night air. It was faint at first, the steady beat of a horse's hooves moving at a walking pace. Not fast, not urgent, just following. Caleb's head snapped up. He instinctively reached for the old rifle he kept tucked in the wagon. Ilara pulled the baby closer, her body going tense. They waited in the flickering firelight, listening. The hoofbeats grew a little louder, then stopped just beyond the ring of light from their camp. A figure sat on a horse, a dark silhouette against the star-dusted sky. No need for that rifle, Caleb, a familiar voice drawled. It was Sheriff Barlow. Caleb slowly lowered the rifle, but he didn't put it down. What do you want, Barlow? The sheriff nudged his horse forward, just enough for the fire to catch the glint of the star on his chest. He wasn't smiling anymore, his eyes were cold and flat. Just checking on Silas's investment, he said, his gaze flicking to Ilara. He was worried. Thought you might have a change of heart out here in the dark. Leave the girl and the baby and make a run for it. Ilara's stomach twisted. He made it sound like she was a sack of grain he was guarding. I keep my bargains, Caleb said, his voice low and tight. I know you do, Barlow said. That's what makes this so interesting. He leaned forward on his saddle horn. See, I was there when your wife's father signed over that land to her, a wedding gift. He made it ironclad, said no man could take it from her or her bloodline. Not for debt, not for anything. Caleb frowned. What's your point? My point, the sheriff said, his voice dropping, is that the deed you signed over to Silas, it might not be worth the paper it's written on. As long as that little girl in her arms is breathing, that land belongs to her, not to you, and you can't bargain with what ain't yours. A cold dread washed over Caleb. He looked at the baby, then back at the sheriff. He'd made a fool's bet with a worthless hand. The deed was useless, which meant the bargain was void. Barlow's lips twisted into a cruel smile. So you see, Silas can come take his daughter back anytime he wants. The horse was just a down payment. He let you get out of town to save face, but he'll be coming for her, unless, of course, something happens to the heir. The threat hung in the air, vile and unmistakable. If the baby were to disappear, the land would revert to Caleb, and the deed would become valid. Silas would get what he wanted. Ilara clutched the sleeping infant so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked from Caleb's horrified face to the sheriff's cold eyes. She had thought she was escaping one monster, only to find herself caught in a trap with another, more patient one. Caleb finally understood. This was never about a horse. It was a cold, calculated plan to steal his land, using his own honor and his daughter's very life as the leverage. Get out of my camp, Barlow, Caleb snarled, raising the rifle again. The sheriff just chuckled, a low, ugly sound. Just delivering a message. He reined his horse back into the darkness. You've got a long walk ahead of you, Caleb. Plenty of time to think about what's most important. The sound of his horse's hooves faded, leaving a silence that was far more terrifying than the noise had been. Caleb and Ilara were alone again, but everything had changed. The small, fragile trust that had started to grow between them was now poisoned by a terrible choice. He could protect his daughter and lose Ilara, or he could honor his deal, a deal which now seemed to put his own child in mortal danger. He looked at Ilara, her face a pale mask in the firelight, her arms wrapped around his daughter like a shield. He had promised to keep his child from growing up alone, but in his desperation, he might have just sentenced her to death. The ranch came into view near dusk the next day. It was a scatter of weathered boards and fences that leaned like weary old men after a long fight. The cabin's roof sagged beneath mismatched patches of tin, its windows dull with a thick layer of dust. A few thin chickens scratched restlessly in the yard. Beyond the fences stretched fields that had gone to weed, their brittle stalks rattling in the wind. Ilara sat stiff in the wagon, the baby swaddled tight in her arms. She took in the sight with no words, only a slow tightening of her jaw. This was the land that held a death sentence over the child she was holding. Caleb, walking beside the broken wheel, lifted his chin as if he was daring the land itself to mock him. When they halted, he reached for the baby, but Ilara drew back instinctively, holding the child closer. His hand fell to his side, awkward and heavy. He understood. After what Barlow had said, how could she trust him? Without a word, he led her toward the cabin. The door groaned on its hinges when he pushed it open. The air inside was stale, with the smell of old wood smoke and a grief so thick you could taste it. Ilara stepped across the threshold and froze. A plain apron hung on a peg on the wall, untouched since its wearer last breathed. A cradle stood near the hearth, but it was unfinished. One of the rockers was missing, lying on the floor beside it. On the table lay a sewing needle, threaded halfway through a piece of cloth, as though a hand had stilled mid-task and never returned. Ilara's throat tightened. Even though she had never met Caleb's wife, she felt her presence everywhere. In the faint scent of lavender soap that still clung to the air, in the folded quilt resting on the foot of the bed, in the profound silence that pressed in against the walls. This wasn't just a house, it was a tomb. And she felt like an intruder, trespassing on another woman's love, another woman's life. Caleb busied himself with the fire, fumbling with the kindling until a few sparks finally caught. His movements were stiff, like a man performing rituals he no longer believed in. When the flame finally licked up the chimney, he pulled a loaf of stale bread from a shelf and set it on the table. His clumsy attempts to slice it ended in jagged, torn pieces. She watched him, her arm still wrapped protectively around the baby. He burned his fingers on the hot pan and hissed in frustration. "Move aside," she said softly. He looked up, startled, but he obeyed. She laid the baby in the cradle with care, ignoring the missing rocker. Then she took the knife from his hand. With a steadiness born of years in her father's house, she cut the bread into even slices and set them in the pan with a little grease. Soon the smell turned rich and comforting. For the first time since leaving town, Caleb's shoulders lowered, just a fraction. Some small piece of his weariness seemed to lift. When they sat down to eat, she placed half the bread before him and kept half for herself. He bowed his head and muttered grace in a rough whisper. Then he chewed slowly, as though he was rediscovering the taste of food made by another person's hand. A silence grew between them, but it was softer now, less jagged than it had been on the road. The threat from Barlow and her father still hung over them, but inside these four walls for a moment it felt far away. She found herself glancing at him when he wasn't looking, noticing the way grief hollowed out his eyes, but hadn't managed to break his gentleness entirely. After supper, the baby started to fuss. Ilara lifted her from the cradle and swayed gently near the fire. She hummed the same low, nameless tune from the road, and the child quieted. Caleb sat in his chair, watching her with a gaze he tried to disguise, but his hands gripped the arms of the chair as if he were steadying himself against the sight. The days that followed were quiet, but they were not empty. Ilara swept the cabin, folded the quilt, and tended to the chickens without ever being asked. Caleb repaired fences, his hands blistering quickly from the unaccustomed work. At night they shared plain meals, and each day the silence that had once weighed so heavy between them loosened a little more. There were no smiles. There were no declarations. But there were small mercies. A cup of water filled before it was asked for, a log added to the fire before it died down. The baby, whose name he finally told her was Hope, was passed gently between them. But the unease lingered, a dark shadow at the edge of their quiet routine. Ilara could not shake the feeling of being a shadow in another woman's home. A replacement, chosen not for who she was, but for what she could provide. A pawn in a game she didn't understand. One evening, she was lingering by the cradle, her fingers brushing against the soft quilt that had belonged to the dead wife, Sarah. "She's still here," she murmured, not meaning for him to hear. Caleb was at the table, mending a piece of harness. He looked up. His voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "She'll always be here, but that don't mean there ain't room for more." The words startled her. She turned, meeting his gaze across the dim light of the fire. Something unspoken passed between them. It was as fragile as a spider's thread, but as dangerous as a spark of hope. She wanted to tell him that she felt like borrowed wood in another woman's fire, but the words tangled in her throat. Later that night, as a storm rolled in across the prairie, Hope began to cry. Not her usual fussing, but a sharp, pained wail that cut through the sound of the wind. Ilara was at her side in an instant. The baby's skin was hot to the touch. Her breathing was shallow and ragged. A fever had taken hold. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Ilara. She'd seen fevers like this take children in the town. There was no doctor for miles. They were completely on their own. Caleb came to stand beside her, his face a mask of fear. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Cool water," she said, her own voice surprisingly calm, taking charge. "And clean rags. Now." He rushed to obey. For the rest of the night, they fought the fever together. Ilara bathed the baby's tiny body, murmuring soft words of comfort, while Caleb kept the fire low and fetched fresh water from the rain barrel. They moved around each other in the small cabin, a silent, desperate dance. In those dark, uncertain hours, they were no longer a rancher and the woman he'd bought. They were just two people, united in their terror, fighting for the life of a child that connected them. Just before dawn, the fever broke. Hope's breathing evened out, and she fell into a deep, peaceful sleep. Ilara sank onto the floor, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Caleb knelt beside her, his hand hovering near her shoulder before he let it drop. "You saved her," he said, his voice thick with emotion. She shook her head, her gaze fixed on the sleeping child. "We saved her." In the quiet of the cabin, with the storm passing outside, something had shifted for good. The fear of her father, of the sheriff, of the impossible bargain, it all seemed to fade next to the fierce, protective instinct that had risen up in her. This child was not just a symbol of a deal, she was hope. And Ilara realized with a startling clarity that she would not let anyone harm her. Caleb saw the look on her face. He saw the iron resolve that had replaced the fear. "The deed," he said suddenly, his voice low and urgent. "Barlow was right. It's worthless as long as hope lives. That's our protection." Ilara looked up at him. "Protection?" "Caleb, that's not protection. It's a target. My father and Barlow won't just give up. They'll find another way." He nodded, his jaw tight. "I know, which is why we have to find out why they want this land so badly. It's not for the dust and weeds. There's something else. Something Sarah knew." He stood up and walked over to the hearth. He reached deep into the chimney, pulling out a loose stone. Behind it was a small, hollowed-out space. From it, he pulled a small, leather-bound book. "Sarah's journal," he said, his voice reverent. "She was always writing in it. I haven't been able to bring myself to read it since she passed. But I think the answers are in here." He handed the journal to Ilara. His eyes met hers, and in that moment, he wasn't just giving her a book. He was giving her his trust. He was making her a partner. She opened the journal. Sarah's handwriting was neat and clear. The first few pages were filled with the simple joys and hardships of a homesteader's life. Talk of planting seasons, of mending clothes, of her love for Caleb. Then the tone began to change. Ilara's breath caught. She read a passage aloud, her voice a hushed whisper. "October 12th, Mr. Egan from the neighboring ranch visited today. He is selling his land to a consortium represented by my father. He seemed frightened. He warned Caleb to be careful. He said the soil here is more valuable than we know. Not for farming. For what's underneath." Caleb's eyes widened. "Underneath?" Ilara kept reading, her fingers tracing the words. Sarah wrote about noticing surveyors near their property line, men she didn't recognize. She wrote about her father, Silas, becoming more and more insistent that they sell the ranch to him, offering them a price that was far too low. Then Ilara found the last entry. It was dated the day before Hope was born, the day Sarah died. Silas was here today. He was angry. He knows I have been asking questions in town. He said things. Terrible things. He said this land holds the key to his fortune and that no one, not even his own blood, would stand in his way. I found something by the creek bed, a rock that shines with a strange dark glitter. I have hidden it. Caleb must know. If anything happens to me. The entry ended there. Abruptly, a chilling realization settled over the small cabin. Sarah's death. It might not have been just the hardship of childbirth. The creek bed, Caleb breathed, his face pale. He grabbed a lantern, and without another word, they went out into the pre-dawn light. They followed the path down to the narrow creek where they had camped on their first night. Ilara's heart pounded in her chest. They searched along the muddy bank, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows, and then Caleb saw it, a pile of stones that looked deliberately placed, hidden under the roots of an old cottonwood tree. He dug with his bare hands, pulling the rocks away. Underneath, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a heavy, dark stone. It was veined with something that glittered in the lantern light, a dull, metallic yellow. Gold. It wasn't a huge nugget, but it was there. Proof. This wasn't just a failing ranch, it was sitting on a gold vein, and Silas knew it. He had known all along. The cruelty of it was staggering. He hadn't just been abusive. He had been trying to drive them off his daughter's own inheritance. He had threatened his own grandchild's life for this, and Sarah had discovered his secret, and she had paid for it with her life. Caleb sank to his knees, the weight of the truth crushing him. He killed her, he whispered, his voice choked with a grief that was now mixed with a burning rage. He didn't swing a rope, but he killed her as surely as if he had. Ilara put a hand on his shoulder. Her own anger was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. This was no longer just about survival. This was about justice. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Caleb looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the dim light. The hollowed-out look of the grieving man was gone. In its place was a hard, dangerous resolve. "We don't run," he said. "We fight. This land is Hope's, and we're going to take back everything your father stole from us, starting with his lies." They returned to the cabin as the sun was rising, the heavy, gold-veined rock clutched in Caleb's hand. The air between them crackled with a new, shared purpose. They were no longer two broken pieces. They were allies. They spent the day planning. They knew they couldn't go to Sheriff Barlow. He was in Silas's pocket. They were on their own. "Your father thinks he's clever," Ilara said, pacing the small cabin floor. "He uses the law when it suits him, and threats when it doesn't. We have to be smarter." Caleb nodded, looking at Sarah's journal. Sarah mentioned a man, Mr. Egan, the neighbor who sold his land. She said he was frightened. Maybe he knows more than he told her. "It's a long shot," Ilara said. "He's probably been paid for his silence." "It's the only shot we have," Caleb replied. "I'll ride out there tomorrow at first light. You stay here, bar the door. Don't open it for anyone." The thought of him leaving, even for a day, filled Ilara with a dread she didn't want to admit. But she knew he was right. She simply nodded, her hand resting on the cradle where Hope was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm gathering around her. That night, an unsettling quiet fell over the ranch. Every creak of the old cabin, every gust of wind sounded like a threat. Ilara sat in a chair by the fire, Caleb's rifle across her lap, watching the door. Caleb sat at the table, cleaning his pistol, his movements precise and deadly. The silence was broken by a soft knock on the door. They both froze. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with alarm. It was too soon for Silas. Who could it be? The knock came again, a little more insistent this time. A man's voice called out, low and trembling. "Caleb? Caleb, it's me. It's the preacher." Caleb and Ilara exchanged a confused look. "The preacher? Here?" Caleb moved to the door, his pistol still in hand. "What do you want, preacher?" He called through the thick wood. "I need to talk to you," the voice came back, laced with urgency. "It's about Sarah, and about the bargain you made. I know the truth, son, and I can't carry this burden alone any longer." Caleb slowly unbarred the door. The preacher stood on the threshold, his face pale and drawn in the moonlight. He wasn't carrying his Bible. He was carrying a shovel. "We have to dig up the truth, Caleb," the preacher said, his eyes filled with a desperate fear, "before it buries us all." The preacher, a man named Elias, stumbled into the cabin, his clothes splattered with mud. He leaned the shovel against the wall and sank into a chair, his body trembling. "Barlow came to see me after you left town," he began, his voice raspy. "He was asking questions. About you, about Sarah. He wanted to see the church records, the baptismal certificate for your little girl." Caleb frowned. "Why would he want that?" "He was looking for a loophole," Elias said, wringing his hands. "He was trying to find a way to prove that the child wasn't legally yours, or that Sarah wasn't of sound mind when the land was willed to her. He's trying to invalidate the inheritance." Ilara felt a chill run down her spine. The depths of her father's greed were bottomless. "But that's not why I'm here," the preacher continued, his gaze finding Caleb's. "I lied, Caleb. I lied at Sarah's funeral. I told everyone she died of a fever after the birth. But that's not the whole truth." The air in the cabin grew thick and cold. "I was the one who found her," Elias whispered, his eyes haunted. "She had sent a message for me to come to the ranch. She said it was urgent. When I arrived, you were in the barn. I found her in the bedroom. She was weak, yes, but there was something else. There was a bruise on her temple. Faint, but it was there. And there was mud on the hem of her nightgown, like she had been outside by the creek." Caleb's blood ran cold. He remembered that day. The midwife had said the birth was hard, that Sarah had been delirious with fever. He had believed it. He had been so consumed by his own grief that he hadn't seen the signs. "She was trying to tell me something," Elias said, his voice cracking. "She kept whispering a word, Silas, and rock. I thought she was delirious, but then, when Silas arrived, the way he looked at her, it wasn't with a father's grief, it was with relief." The preacher took a shaky breath. "I was a coward. Silas is a powerful man in that town. Barlow is his dog on a leash. I was afraid, so I kept my mouth shut. I let everyone believe the lie. But when Barlow came to me tonight, trying to dig up dirt to steal her child's birthright, I knew God would not forgive another silence." He looked down at his muddy hands. "I went to the churchyard tonight. I went to Sarah's grave." Caleb stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. "What did you do?" "I didn't disturb her rest," Elias said quickly. "But I remembered something. Just before we laid her to rest, I saw Silas drop something into the grave, a small object. He thought no one was looking. I went back tonight. I dug at the side of the coffin, and I found this." From his pocket, the preacher pulled a small, tarnished silver locket. Caleb recognized it instantly. It was Sarah's, but it was the one she had lost months before she died. She had been heartbroken about it. He took the locket, his fingers trembling. He fumbled with the clasp. It snapped open. Inside, there were no pictures. Instead, there was a tiny, tightly folded piece of paper. Ilara came to stand beside him, her hand on his arm, as he carefully unfolded the delicate paper. It was a signed affidavit, a legal document, witnessed by Mr. Egan, the neighbor. It stated that Silas had approached Egan with a fraudulent document, a forged version of Sarah's deed, and had tried to coerce him into signing it, effectively transferring ownership of Sarah's mineral rights to Silas. Egan had refused, and Silas had threatened him. This was it. Hard proof of Silas's scheme, but there was something else written at the bottom, in Sarah's own hand. "My father knows I have this. He came to the house tonight. He is not the man I thought he was. He is a monster. I am afraid. I have hidden the rock. If you are reading this, Caleb, it means I could not tell you myself. Do not let him win. Protect our hope." The last words were smudged, as if by a tear. The truth settled in the room, heavy and undeniable. Silas hadn't just let his daughter die. He had confronted her, likely fought with her. His actions had led directly to her death. He was a murderer. The shovel, Caleb said, his voice a low growl. It wasn't for the grave, was it? The preacher shook his head. No, it was for this. He pointed toward the hearth. Beneath the floorboards. Sarah told me in her last letter where she hid the rest of her proof. Account ledgers from your father-in-law's business. Ledgers showing he's been secretly buying up mineral rights all over the county, using intimidation and fraud. That locket was the key. She knew Silas would never look for it on her own body. Suddenly, the sound of splintering wood shattered the night. The cabin door burst open, crashing against the wall. Sheriff Barlow stood in the doorway, his pistol aimed directly at Caleb. Behind him stood Ilara's father, Silas, his face a mask of pure rage, and with them were two hired thugs, rough men with cold eyes. Looks like the prayer meeting is over, Barlow sneered. Hand over the journal, the rock, and that locket, Caleb, and no one else has to get hurt. Silas's eyes were fixed on Ilara, a venomous hatred in his gaze. You should have stayed bought, girl. Now you'll be buried next to the woman whose life you tried to steal. The confrontation exploded in the tiny cabin. Caleb moved with a speed born of rage, shoving the table toward Barlow and giving Ilara and the preacher precious seconds to scramble back. One of the hired thugs lunged for him, but Caleb was ready. He brought his pistol up, not to fire, but to use as a club, striking the man hard across the temple. The other thug grabbed Ilara. She fought back with a ferocity that surprised him, kicking and scratching, her only thought to keep him away from the cradle where Hope had started to cry. Silas ignored the chaos, his eyes greedily fixed on the hearth. He shoved the preacher aside and grabbed the shovel. The ledgers are here, he yelled to Barlow. Forget the rest of it. This is all the proof we need to burn. He began frantically prying at the floorboards near the fireplace. Barlow raised his gun, trying to get a clear shot at Caleb, who was now grappling with the first thug. Stay still, you fool, or I'll put you down. The preacher, Elias, saw his moment. While everyone was distracted, he grabbed the heavy, gold-veined rock from the table. With a cry of righteous fury, he charged at Barlow, swinging the rock like a holy instrument of vengeance. The rock connected with Barlow's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The pistol clattered to the floor. Barlow howled in pain, clutching his shattered wrist. Ilara saw her chance. She stomped down hard on the foot of the man holding her, and as he grunted and loosened his grip, she wrenched free. She didn't run. She dove for Barlow's fallen pistol. At the same time, Silas managed to pry a floorboard loose. He reached into the dark space beneath and pulled out a dusty, leather-bound ledger. He held it up with a triumphant cry. It's over, Caleb. Your wife's legacy is nothing but ash. He turned to throw the ledger into the fireplace, but suddenly he stopped. He was looking at the barrel of a pistol. Ilara was standing there, the heavy gun held steady in her two hands, aimed directly at his chest. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise of the fight. It was colder than any winter wind. You will not burn another piece of her life, she said. The fight stopped. Everyone froze. Caleb, the thugs, the whimpering sheriff. They all stared at the woman who had been traded for a horse, the woman her father had called useless and weak. Silas stared at his daughter, disbelief warring with rage on his face. You wouldn't dare, he sneered. You don't have the spine. You beat the weakness out of me a long time ago, Ilara replied, her voice unwavering. All you left was this. Her eyes were clear and hard. In that moment, she was not a victim. She was a survivor. She was a protector. She was a mother. Behind Silas, Caleb had subdued the second thug. He stood, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on Ilara with a look of pure awe. The standoff stretched for a heartbeat. The only sound was the crackling fire and the soft crying of the baby in the cradle. Then, from the darkness outside, another voice called out, Silas! Barlow! It's over! A man stepped into the doorway, holding a rifle. He was weathered and old, with honest eyes. Behind him stood half a dozen other men, ranchers from the surrounding area, all armed. It was Mr. Egan. The preacher sent his boy for us before he came here, Egan said, his rifle aimed steady at Silas. He told us everything, about Sarah, about the gold, about your threats. We've had enough of you bleeding this valley dry, Silas. Silas's face crumpled. He was trapped. The law, his hired muscle, his own daughter. They had all turned against him. He was a king who had just lost his entire kingdom. With a desperate, animalistic snarl, he lunged, not at Ilara, but toward the cradle. But Caleb was faster. He threw himself in front of the cradle, taking the force of Silas's charge. The two men crashed to the floor. The ledger flew from Silas's hand, sliding across the room. Ilara didn't hesitate. She didn't shoot. She did something her father would never expect. She lowered the gun, ran past the struggling men, and scooped her baby out of the cradle. She held Hope tight against her chest, turning her back on the violence, shielding the child with her own body. It was over. Mr. Egan and the other ranchers swarmed the cabin, subduing the thugs and tying up the whimpering sheriff. Caleb, with a strength he didn't know he possessed, finally pinned Silas to the floor. Justice had come to the small, broken-down ranch. Not with a gavel or a judge, but with the courage of a disgraced preacher, the honesty of a frightened neighbor, and the fierce love of two broken people who had found a reason to become whole. In the aftermath, the cabin was a wreck of overturned furniture and shattered lies. But in the middle of it all, a family stood whole. Mr. Egan picked up the ledger and Sarah's journal. "We'll take these and these men to the federal marshal in the next county," he said, his voice firm. "Barlow and Silas won't be poisoning this place any longer." The preacher, Elias, helped Caleb to his feet. "The Lord sets the lonely in families," he said, his voice filled with a weary but profound relief. He looked at Ilara, who was softly humming to the now quiet baby. "And sometimes he sends them through the fire to burn away the impurities." As the ranchers led the prisoners away, a quiet peace settled over the cabin. Caleb walked over to Ilara. He didn't speak. He just gently touched Hope's cheek, his fingers brushing against Ilara's hand. She didn't pull away. The next morning, under a clear, clean sky, they stood outside the cabin. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. Caleb held the unfinished rocker in his hands. "I think it's time we finished this," he said softly. He knelt by the cradle, which they had brought out into the sunshine. Ilara sat on the cabin steps, holding Hope. She watched as he carefully began to fit the last piece into place. His hands, once clumsy and hesitant, were now steady and sure. When he was done, he gave the cradle a gentle push. It rocked back and forth with a smooth, even rhythm. A perfect rhythm. He looked up at Ilara, and for the first time, a real smile reached his eyes. It was a smile of gratitude, of partnership, of a future he had never thought he would have. She smiled back. It was small and fragile, but it was real. This was not a mansion, nor a vow spoken loud in a church. This was a home built of dust and tears, of shared danger and quiet courage. It was a love that hadn't begun with a kiss, but with a bargain made in a dusty street. A bargain that had turned into a promise that had become a family. Maybe, she thought, as she looked from the rocking cradle to the man who saw her, who stood with her. Maybe that was how the best homes were made. One small, impossible kindness at a time. Which city are you watching our video from? Please leave a comment. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel as well. Thank you.